I'm Stuart Varney.
I'm Harris Faulkner.
I'm Brian Kilmeade, and this is the Fox News Rundown.
Wednesday, February 15th, 2023. I'm Lisa Brady. They were pandemic lifelines. Now, Congress wants to know how they ended up in the wrong hands.
We were in crisis. In crisis of the highest order, mind you. And so people weren't too hot worrying about strings being attached and saying, how do you decide who gets what?
I'm Dave Anthony. It's been more than a week since Turkey was devastated by an earthquake. And we take you there as they keep searching for survivors.
Can we find anybody that's currently alive? Can we hear them? The dogs will run over the rubble pile and see if they can detect human scent.
And I'm Carol Markowitz. I've got the final word on the Fox News Rundown.
This month alone, federal prosecutors have announced multiple convictions for COVID relief fraud, money that was intended to help keep Americans and businesses afloat during the depths of the pandemic, being tapped instead by people committing wire fraud or money laundering. And Congress is also on the case.
We owe it to the American people to get to the bottom of the greatest theft of American taxpayer dollars in history.
The new chair of the House Oversight Committee, Kentucky Republican James Comer, made COVID fraud his first hearing earlier this month.
We must identify where this money went, how much ended up in the hands of fraudsters or ineligible participants, and what should be done to ensure that it never happens again.
Justice Department Inspector General Michael Horowitz telling lawmakers that in the Small Business Administration's Paycheck Protection Program, almost $400 billion was given out in 2 weeks.
$3.6 billion shouldn't have gone out right away. Not saying every one of those would have been denied, but at a minimum, there should have been secondary screening.
Democrats emphasizing the legitimate need for the money.
Yes, no program is perfect, but it really did keep afloat the American economy and made sure that we didn't fall into a deep, deep recession.
California Congressman Jimmy Gomez also accusing Republicans of trying to rewrite history after supporting trillions in COVID relief during the Trump administration. But there is bipartisan concern about it being stolen.
So it's a huge range.
Fox Business's Grady Trimble.
The number that they've kind of been pointing us to at this point is $191 billion in unemployment insurance fraud, $158 billion in PPP, remember the Paycheck Protection Program from the early days of the pandemic in the CARES Act. So between those two types of fraud related to COVID relief, the total's right around $350 billion, which sounds like a huge amount, but that's nothing compared to what some estimates suggest it could be, because that's what our estimates are based on what they know. What they are suspicious of is that there's all sorts of fraud that happened that we are not aware of and that we haven't cracked down on. And it could total something like $1 trillion, which is 20% of all of the COVID relief. So, a huge portion of all of that relief went to fraudulent causes, essentially.
I know there have been some cases that prosecutors are working on around the country, charging people with COVID fraud, essentially. But what else is being done? Is Congress trying to track down kind of the total amount of fraud? Are they trying to find more of it? What steps are being taken?
Yeah, so the biggest development over the last couple of weeks have been coming from two branches. The first is President Biden, who said the watchdogs are back, that he's going to crack down on the crooks who stole all of this relief money. House Republicans here on Capitol Hill say that President Biden hasn't been doing enough. And so they're holding their own hearings and investigating where all of this money went. And so, yes, that is the goal, is to ultimately track down, where all of it went and hopefully help us from getting into this type of situation again with future programs similar to this one.
What kind of fraud are we talking about? What are some of the most maybe unusual examples or the biggest examples that you have found?
Yeah, so in one case, there's a man who was accused of, he created this MBE Capital Partners LLC, and then was supposed to be lending out the money, but they're either saying he wasn't lending the money or he was taking a cut of that money to the tune of $70 million. And then some other examples are to do with the unemployment benefits. up to $30 million in some cases, where people were filing false claims for these enhanced benefits. And so, those are the extreme examples. But even if you just Google COVID fraud, you'll see examples that are much smaller than those in the millions of dollars, just people who were applying for these enhanced benefits through somebody else's name, or multiple people's names that they were falsifying to get the benefits. And it could be, tens of thousands of dollars all the way up to, tens of millions of dollars.
Are they optimistic, meaning, Congress and prosecutors, optimistic of getting at least some of these billions back that were stolen?
Well, by some counts, they've already gotten more than 1,000 people either, in plea deals, or they have been found guilty and convicted of these crimes. So that's progress, but it's a small portion of, the amount of money we're talking about. I think it's going to be hard to get all of this money back, especially if it's $1 trillion that we're talking about. But I think it's best for them to be forward looking and say, what can we learn from the mistakes we made in the past, even if we can't get this taxpayer money back this time around?
Congress started approving COVID relief bills the same month the World Health Organization declared a pandemic.
The main process, the thought process at that stage, was just get the money out the door.
Fox News senior congressional correspondent Chad Pergram.
The economy is going to be in shambles. You're going to have people on the street. You're going to have people out of jobs. You're going to have probably the worst economic depression since the 1920s. So just get the money out the door. And remember that they did this in 2 or 3 waves. There was a very small amount of money that was approved, mostly in the health realm, in very early March of 2020. Then about 2 or 3 weeks later, we realized just how bad this was, and the world started to shut down. So they got this next tranche of money out the door, which was big. And then they had to come back and reload the Paycheck Protection Program, the PPP. Remember how popular that was? That was basically just saving, firms from laying off jobs. And that's where a lot of this fraud seems to have stemmed from. The idea that you had people who were saying, okay, I had X business, and some of it was very small, de minimis, small amounts of money that they were, fraudulently bilking the government out of. In other cases, you had people go and buy luxury homes, luxury sports cars. And so that first, few waves of money through 2020, that was all done on a bipartisan basis. So get to 2021, this is March, and the Democrats are then in control of the House and Senate and have a Democrat in the White House. And then they passed a $2 trillion COVID bill on a partisan basis. I mean, this is the biggest amount of money that the federal government has ever shoved out the door at once. And so it should probably come as no surprise that you're going to have some of the highest levels of fraud.
Right. I mean, if you're talking about the total amount of COVID relief passed in both the Trump and Biden administrations, I mean, it's trillions of dollars.
Yeah, it's about $5.5 trillion, give or take.
Is there a focus on one administration or the other, or what was passed when, or are they taking in Congress a broad look at all of the COVID relief and all of the fraud, no matter when it happened?
Well, this is what the administration and some in Congress are trying to do, but mostly on the Republican side. Republicans are trying to kind of do a little bit of sleight of hand here, saying, okay, there's fraud out there. We're having this big conversation about raising the debt ceiling right now. So what can we claw back from people? Or what's unspent out there? And can we use that toward deficit reduction? Well, okay, fine. Let's say that there is several $100 billion in fraud out there and they're able to get all of it back. They need to cut about $7 trillion in spending. So on the high water mark, there's, 400 or 500 billion in fraud. You have to do that about 14 times to get to your 7 trillion. So this might help a little bit, but when they talk about trying to deal with the national debt and trying to raise the debt ceiling, which is why this conversation has been merged, that's not going to get you very far, just getting, COVID money back. And that's something that Republicans, frankly, from a policy standpoint, are trying to hang their hat on.
What can be done about fraud going forward? Are there specific proposals yet in Congress to address the issue so this doesn't happen again?
Well, this came up at a House hearing the other day where you had the head of the Governmental Accountability Office, Gene Dodaro, testify. And he was talking about just the metrics that they were using. It's hard to keep track of it because you had so many people being eligible for this. It's very hard to track. And the problem with that COVID bill or the COVID bills in 2020 is you have to go back to the mindset. We were in crisis. I mean, in crisis of the highest order, mind you. And so people weren't too hot worrying about strings being attached and saying, how do you decide who gets what? I mean, one of the concerns was that if we don't get this out the door fast, the economy is going to collapse. If you got it, you thought that might be a death sentence. So they weren't too worried about putting strings on this. It was just efficiency, getting the money out the door as quickly as possible. Now, you could have another need for something else that isn't as big a crisis as COVID, and they could, try to put these strictures in there. But, this is what's interesting in following legislation for many years, Lisa, is that legislation is written, and it's written in a very concrete form, but there's always people who are attorneys or people who are affected by the law industry or businesses, and they figure out a way to either use the law to their advantage or get around it. I will say this. There is probably far better accounting now of dealing with, just how federal money is spent, and we spend more of it now, and we have a, $31.5 trillion debt right now. So, yeah, it's very hard, especially when you're dealing with these gigantic dollar figures.
Just one other question about the kind of the bigger picture in Congress right now. Are they concerned about COVID fraud, or is it more something that can be used right now in this bigger debate about spending and the debt limit?
I think that there's two things going on. I do think that members are a little more concerned about COVID fraud because there's probably not going to be, barring anything else happen, another big COVID bill. But I think the problem when you look at this is that Republicans now in the majority in the House need an issue. And they know they can't cut $7 trillion. So that's why Republicans are honing in on this, because this is something they can attack. And also, it's a good foil because, Republicans ostensibly, small government, supposedly want to spend less money, although we can argue about some of the, the history with that, frankly, with Republican presidents and Republican Congresses. But this is a way for them to say, yes, we're against what the administration did. They probably would have less of an issue. The Republicans would have, had the Democrats not passed their own $2.1 trillion COVID bill in March of 2021. Because then that was all the Democrats. The Democrats had a majority in the House, majority in the Senate. President Biden was new on the scene, and they were able to do it. And so they would have less of an argument now. But this is, Republicans in the House trying to find something that they can, make into an issue, number one. I do think that there is some genuine concern about that. But it's also, we're deep enough past the pandemic now, the worst parts of the pandemic, that people can go back and say, yeah, maybe we should study some of this.
Chad Pergram, Fox News senior congressional correspondent. Thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure.
This is Carol Markowitz with your Fox News commentary coming up.
It was Monday of last week when the earth quaked in southern Turkey and northern Syria. A powerful magnitude 7.8 jolt as people slept, followed by many aftershocks, including one almost as powerful. But 9 days later, they're not giving up hope. They've been finding survivors in the rubble of thousands of collapsed buildings every day. That was one of the rescues yesterday. People trapped alive more than 200 hours. Imagine that. But for each of those moments of joy, there's a lot more grief. The number of earthquake deaths is closing in on 40,000. Many more injured or not found.
8 girls are missing, and no trace of them so far. The debris removal has been completed in their building, and nobody found anything.
Those girls are that man's relatives. And he says, through a translator,
families went to the hospital to give a DNA test, but we can't get any news, neither dead nor alive. We're just waiting to find a trace.
Hundreds of thousands of people are left homeless, some living in tents. Many need food and water. The situation's even more dire in Syria. The civil war and political strife there has made it difficult to get any aid in or rescue crews. The State Department's Ned Price says,
the images of this tragedy are profound, and we are working to assist those in need day in and day out.
John Morrison is part of that effort, and we caught up with him in the city of Adıyaman, Turkey.
It really is humbling how much power earthquakes have to destroy the cities we build.
He's part of the USAID's Urban Search and Rescue Team from Fairfax County, Virginia.
Not only is it a team of 80 people and 6 search dogs from Fairfax County, Virginia, there's also another one of identical size from Los Angeles County, California. And so that's a lot of people and a lot of things. When we come into these cities, that we bring everything that we need. So whether that be our tents, our generators, our food, our water, all of our rescue equipment, all of our medical equipment, we bring with us because we don't want to be a burden on the local government that's already dealing with a crisis of their own. So to transport all of that and all the people is a logistical challenge. And so we had arranged several buses along with several tractor trailers that moved all of this equipment. Our trip from Incirlik Air Base to Adıyaman took us about 12 hours. A lot of it because of road damage. Certain bridges were unavailable, and so they had to be rerouted around, and just traffic. People trying to get to either help in this area or get out from this area complicates a lot of the situation.
That 12-hour ride, you must have seen a lot of just horrible stuff.
Yeah, it's traveling through all of those cities as you get here, and you sort of have to assess how the collapses have happened, and we start doing our work the second we start seeing those buildings of how they've collapsed here. It's probably very similar to how they're collapsing in other cities. So you're doing a sort of reconnaissance as you go, and most of us are firefighters, and we're very used to when the call comes out, you sort of get that adrenaline dump and able to go straight to work.
So you get there and you set up your base, and then what?
So actually, while we're setting up our base, we're actually sending out what we call our Recon teams. And what they do is they're usually a 4-person crew that consists of an officer, sort of a team leader, an engineer, a dog handler, and a search specialist. And they're going out and they're trying to do what we call triage, going through the city and trying to find, can we find anybody that's currently alive? Can we hear them? The dogs will run over the rubble pile and see if they can detect human scent. And also capturing, okay, we don't know that somebody's alive in this building, but we don't know that somebody isn't. And we know that people are missing. And so we start categorizing all of that so we can do the most good for the most people.
But you had to have people on the ground telling you, hey, we've been hearing voices from this building or from this area.
Exactly. And the people here are our best sorts of intelligence. And we have translators that USAID provided for us. And so that they allow us to interface with the local community who really guide us on, this is the building you need to focus on. And that allows us to prioritize our work sites.
But now it's more than a week. We did hear on Tuesday some more people rescued alive. That's more than 200 hours. That's amazing. I mean, that has to almost be at the limit of how much people can survive.
There's a lot that goes into the survivability profile of a victim, whether they're pinned in a structure, meaning that the structure is on top of them and they can't move because it's pinning their leg down, or whether they're entombed, how healthy they were before the earthquake, how much room they have to maneuver around. The earthquake happened very early in the morning, so we look at residential structures where people were sleeping. Maybe they had bedding that's keeping them a little bit warm, and obviously it's warmer inside the base of the structure than it would be outside. Do they have access to food and water? All those things play into that survivability profile. And we're still in rescue mode. We intend to be in rescue mode until we're told otherwise by the Turkish authorities. But in this case, we're trying to get to the most deeply intuned people now. That's what our team specializes in. By the time we get to a place like this, typically most of the people that are lightly trapped or on the top floor of a collapsed building have been rescued by local authorities. And so we are focusing on those void spaces that are underneath big, heavy concrete buildings.
You talked about the dogs. How far down can a victim be for the dog to still be able to pick up the scent?
It really depends. And that goes to how enclosed the space is that the victim is sort of breathing in and their scent is permeating in. And once that scent builds up, it may come out in very different places in the building. And so we use the dogs as one tool out of many to sort of locate hey, there's alive or somebody that was recently alive victim in this section of the building or in this area. And then we'll use our listening devices and our cameras to hone in on exactly where that victim may be. And then our rescue specialists will get in there and make access to the victim and remove them.
Dogs, they can differentiate, right, between somebody who's dead and somebody who is still alive in the scent, right?
Absolutely. Correct. And the dogs we bring with us are live find dogs for these missions. We do bring human and range detection dogs with us for some domestic missions, but for international, it's solely the live find dogs that we bring.
It has to be delicate, though, to get to extract someone from deep down. I imagine the structure is not very safe, and if you do something here, it could lead to a collapse there, right?
It's for lack of a better term, a high stakes game of Jenga a little bit. We bring our structural engineers with us. They're specifically trained on collapsed building engineering, along with people that specialize in heavy rigging. So working with local crane operators to lift some of these slabs off the ground or off the top level of the building so that we can more quickly get into these void spaces underneath the building. So you're exactly right. When one of these slabs gets lifted off, the building moves. When you step on a piece of rubble, the whole building can sort of move with you. So we are very cautious. Safety is an incredibly top priority of ours. And we want to make sure that we're not getting hurt and contributing to the problem. We want to be able to help.
Since you've been there, your team, how many people do you think you have rescued from the rubble?
We've assisted a lot of teams here. Our teams solely by ourselves have not rescued anybody yet. A lot of these sites have a lot of rescue teams on them. And so we've certainly helped a lot of the local teams, which is a lot of our goal is to support the local responders and be able to provide our capacity, whether they need the technical expertise of our rigging specialists or rescue specialists or the search to back up one of their canine hits or our doctors to provide medical advice. We're here to help in any capacity we can.
Have you had people say that we still hear something in the rubble?
We have. We're working active piles right now, and oftentimes it's chasing stories of somebody that said that they heard something, or somebody said that somebody else heard that they heard something, and so you kind of have to do your best guess and figure out if it's a possibility of search. And we go into these buildings and do our best and try and locate all of these victims as best we can.
Meanwhile, the survivors who are desperate to find someone, are they just standing there watching? What's it like?
I think one of the things that struck me most about this, and this has happened in other disasters as well, is the resiliency of the population. People are opening their storefronts in the buildings that still stand, and they're driving around and trying to get back to some semblance of normalcy. And when we're working on work sites, they're offering us food and water. And it really is sort of humbling a little bit to, be here in a disaster helping respond, and somebody's offering you something that they have limited quantities of because they know that we're trying to help. And that is really moving. And it's one of the things that I take away from this most.
People who were left homeless, some of them are intense, right? I've seen so many stories of a lack of food or not much food or water, and there's a lot of people in different parts of the region who have nothing.
Yeah, and they may not want to live back in their homes that they know are damaged for fear of an aftershock. So it's certainly something that, NGOs and the Turkish authorities are going to have to respond to and help with. But yeah, it's certainly the case.
There's a lot of anger that are reports that people are upset about the government, or also developers who may have cut corners in constructing buildings. Can you tell when you get there that certain buildings were not necessarily built very well?
Not necessarily. I mean, the power of these earthquakes, when they get up into the upper sevens and above, it really can damage the best built buildings. So that's not something we look at. We just sort of take the building for the way it is right now as a rubble pile and how it can affect us with our rescues and go to work.
How cold? You mentioned at night it can be. How cold has it been at nighttime for people who are potentially still trapped alive?
It's in the 40s during the day. It's in the 20s at night. Hypothermia is certainly something we're ready to treat for if we come upon a patient with warm IV bags and additional blankets and everything else. And our doctors are specifically ready to treat for that, crush syndrome, and anything else they may find a victim with.
How bad is this scene versus others you've been to? Can you rank it?
It's comparable to some of the worst. I was along with many other members of our team, we're in Haiti in 2010, where hundreds of thousands of people were killed. We have team members that are here today that were back in Turkey in 1999 for the earthquakes that were there. So this is certainly a disaster. Turkey has a robust search and rescue program within its national capacity. But when you start getting to disasters of this scale, it really overwhelms the resources. And that's why they've called for international assistance, and we were honored to come help.
John Morrison with the USAID's International Urban Search and Rescue Team from Fairfax County, Virginia, in Adıyaman, Turkey at the moment, rescuing people. Thank you so much for joining us.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
And in other news,
I'm Gianna Gelosi. If Valentine's Day reminded you that you're unlucky in love, there may be one way to bump up your chances of getting hit with Cupid's arrow between now and next Valentine's Day: posing with a pet for your dating profile pic. Singles who included photos of themselves posing with a pup on their dating profile were more likely to find a match, according to a recent poll of British adults commissioned by Guide Dogs, a nonprofit organization that provides guide dog services. 2/3 of people admitted that they're more likely to match with someone if their dating profile includes a picture of a dog. 6 in 10 people say they believe owning a dog is a good sign that a person is ready to settle down in a committed relationship. People also presume dog owners to be more social, active, and empathetic. Half of those polled even said they would borrow a family or friend's dog for a photo shoot to bolster their dating profile. A separate study conducted by One Poll for the brand World's Best Cat Litter recently found the majority of respondents said they'd be more interested in someone if their dating profile included a photo of themselves cuddling a cat. The study polled 1,000 Americans who own cats and 1,000 who don't, and found feline parents were slightly more likely to be involved in a relationship than non-cat owners. And 4 in 10 people have gone home with a potential date specifically to meet that person's pet. For the Fox News Rundown, I'm Gianna Gelosi.
From the Fox News Podcasts Network. Stay on top of the latest news and information from Fox News. Listen and download the Fox News Hourly Update on your time. The trending stories you need anytime you want it. Listen and download now by going to foxnewspodcasts.com. Rate and review the Fox News Rundown on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen.
It's time for your Fox News commentary. Carol Markowitz.
What's on your mind?
I hold grudges against companies. We don't wear Nike because the company embraced America-hating former quarterback Colin Kaepernick. And for a family with 2 immigrant parents, blessed to be Americans, we cannot abide this. I stopped using Gillette products when their ad tore into boys and men as angry possible rapists. And our family canceled a trip to Disney World last year after the company inserted itself into the political debate over Florida's parental rights law. Manhattan Institute senior fellow Chris Rufo showcased leaked videos from inside the company openly discussing, quote, adding queerness into children's programming. Barring Disney from our lives didn't feel great. This is a storied American company. Its success is the epitome of the American dream. I wanted a path back to being a Disney family and looked for signs that it had learned its lesson. Disney was quiet after the leak and went on to replace its CEO. Its pointed silence on political issues led me to believe it was changing for the better. So when I was invited to speak at a conference held at Disney World last weekend, we made the call to go as a family and take our kids to the parks. We arrived at the hotel late, and while my husband and I checked in, the kids watched a TV in the lobby. I remember the show from when I was little, my still little 7-year-old exclaimed. It was The Three Caballeros, his favorite. As I looked up the year the film was made, 1944, I discovered that Disney had inserted a disclaimer before the film that notes, quote, this program includes negative depictions and or mistreatment of people or cultures. These stereotypes were wrong then and are wrong now. Rather than remove this content, we want to acknowledge its harmful impact, learn from it, and spark conversation to create a more inclusive future together, end quote. The disclaimer also appears before films like Aladdin, Dumbo, and Peter Pan. It's another attempt by Disney to placate the woke critics. It's not a coincidence that while the failing streaming service tries to be ever more woke, the parks have somewhat resisted it, but not entirely. We learned in the leaked videos that Disney no longer uses ladies and gentlemen at the parks, lest someone feel they don't fit into either of those categories. And like all attempts to be gender neutral, women get erased completely. The Bibbidi Bobbidi Boutique, where little girls get their hair and makeup done to become godmothers in training, is now using the more inclusive fairy godmothers apprentices. Can't let anyone know girls exist. Walking around the parks with an eye on what the woke will target next is an exercise in finding problematic issues everywhere. Disney World bathroom signage at the parks still has depictions of dresses for girls and pants for boys. Uh-oh. It's a Small World uses the same stereotypical depictions of various cultures that Disney has informed us are unacceptable. The Hall of Presidents has much that it chooses not to depict about each man. There is no pacifying the rabid left, and the sooner Disney learns this, the better. We had loved the Disney parks on past visits. Those of us still hoping that Disney can reverse course lose a little of that hope every time the company does something clearly bad for its business. We may think of Disney as too big to fail today, but plenty of huge companies have collapsed after taking a wrong turn. Disney is taking such a turn today. Despite its prevalence, wokeness is deeply unpopular in America. They're loud, but they're nowhere near the majority. Disney is running out of time to see the light and go back to Walt Disney's pro-America, pro-child vision that we all had known and loved. Or we'll be telling stories about a great American company that once existed but fell for the woke virus and was killed by it. This is Carol Markowitz, columnist at the New York Post and FoxNews.com.
You've been listening to the Fox News Rundown. And now, stay up to date by subscribing to this podcast at foxnewspodcasts.com. Listen ad-free on Fox News Podcasts Plus on Apple Podcasts. And Prime members can listen to the show ad-free on Amazon Music. And for up-to-the-minute news, go to foxnews.com.
I'm Guy Benson. Join me weekdays at 3 p.m. Eastern as we break down the biggest stories of the day with some of the biggest newsmakers and guests. Listen live on the Fox News app or get the free podcast at GuyBensonShow.com.